My name is Gaynor, and I had what you might call a before and after childhood. Before my father died, we were an ordinary happy family. Mom, Dad, me, and my older brother Steven. Steven was 2 years older than me, always looked out for me, taught me to ride a bike and not be afraid of bullies at school. We lived in a small house with a white fence and blooming roses on the porch. In the summer, Mom baked blueberry pies, Dad fixed something in the garage, and Steven and I ran around the yard playing nights. When I was 6 and Steven was 8, our lives changed forever. Dad had a heart attack. It happened on a typical Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting at the kitchen table helping Steven with his homework, and the next minute he was clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. I didn't understand what was going on, but Mom screamed and rushed to the phone. The ambulance arrived, but it was too late. Dad left as suddenly as the lights go out in the room. He just wasn't there anymore. After that, our house became different. Mom walked around in a daze, her eyes were always red, and her shoulders were tense. She worked and took care of us, but the lightness she had before was gone. And soon Jim came into our lives. Mom met him 6 months after Dad's death, and 6 months later they got married. Jim was tall, with a loud voice and heavy steps. He wasn't an evil person, but he didn't radiate warmth either. Steven didn't like him from the beginning, and I just didn't know how to treat him. When Mom got pregnant, it became clear that her attention was now focused on her new family. She took care of us, but not in the same way as before. The day Penelope was born, I looked at the tiny bundle in my mom's arms and felt nothing. No joy, no affection, just emptiness. Steven felt the same way. We became each other's only support. The older we got, the more we moved away from home. After school, Steven went to college in another city, and a year later I left. It seemed to me that a new life was finally beginning. I got a job with an insurance company, rented a tiny studio, and enjoyed my freedom. One evening, the bell rang. "I'm getting married," Steven's voice sounded joyful. "It's amazing," I exclaimed. He had been dating Kendra for almost 2 years. She was kind, smart, and made him happy. I was happy for him, but soon news came that made my heart sink. Our grandma Rose, Dad's mom, passed away unexpectedly. She was our bond with my father, telling us stories about him, cherishing his memory. After the funeral, we found out that she had left Steven and me an apartment. It wasn't a luxury apartment, but it was in good neighborhoods and could change our lives. "What are you going to do with your apartment?" I asked my brother over a cup of coffee. "I'll sell it," he replied. "Kendra and I are planning to buy a house, and this will be a good startup capital." I tried to convince him otherwise. Real estate is getting more expensive, maybe it's worth waiting. But he had already made his decision. A month later, the apartment was sold, and Steven proudly showed me photos of a brand new Range Rover. Unlike him, I decided to keep mine. A few weeks later, I moved into it, realizing that now I have my own place, something that no one can take away. Steven and Kendra got married the following spring, as planned. It was a beautiful, simple ceremony where there was no excessive pomp, only warmth, sincere smiles, and joy. I stood among the guests, watching them exchange vows, and tears rolled down my cheeks. Not because I was sad, but because I saw two happy people in front of me, ready to start a life together. It seemed to me that even Dad was with us that day, somewhere nearby, watching, smiling, proud. 3 years have passed. Steven and Kendra have twin boys, Jack and Noah. They were small, rosy-cheeked, with eyes that looked so much like our father's. Children's laughter always sounded in Steven's house, and the shelves were filled with toys, but with the joy came difficulties. By then, Steven had realized the bitter truth about his decision. The money earned from the sale of my grandmother's apartment was not enough for the initial payment for the house. Property prices in our rapidly rising city have risen too high. Steven and Kendra had to rent a place, and the costs were rising, especially with the arrival of two new small mouths. "I should have listened to you," Steven confessed one day as we sat in the park and watched the twins play in the sandbox. His voice sounded tired. "We are still renting, and with these prices, we may always rent." I put my hand on his shoulder. Don't blame yourself. You're giving your boys something important. They will have an education and the opportunity to build their future. Dad would be proud. Those words were true, but I could see how hard it was for him. Stephen invested the remaining money in trust funds for the boys. It was the right decision, but like all adults, he carried the weight of his choices. Meanwhile, my life was going well. I have achieved several promotions, my job has become stable, and I have saved enough to buy a new, more spacious apartment in a modern house with amenities. I plan to rent out my grandmother's apartment and make it an additional source of income. But then an unexpected conversation took place. It was Sunday, a rare family dinner at Mom and Jim's. Penelope looked tense, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "Gaynor, can I talk to you?" "What is it?" she asked, catching me at the window. I nodded. "Marvin and we got married last month," she said quickly. "In court. I know it's unexpected, but we love each other and we didn't want to wait." It was the first time I heard about their marriage. "We're still in college," Penelope continued, "but the thing is, living with Mom and Jim, it's hard, you know how Mom is. He controls everything, constantly intervenes. I heard you're going to rent out Grandma's apartment. Marvin and we thought maybe we could live there until we graduate from college, until we get back on our feet." I was confused. Penelope and I have never been particularly close. And yet, she was a sister, family. "How much is left before the end?" I asked, trying to stay calm. 2 years, she replied. "By that time, we will have graduated, and Marvin is already interning at a technology company. But now we can't pay the rent." I thought about it. The apartment was empty, and no matter how you look at it, helping a family is the right thing to do. "Don't worry about the rent," I said, hearing my own voice as if from outside. "The main thing is to finish your studies. After the release, we will review the terms." Penelope smiled with relief, thanked him, and soon she and Marvin moved in. I paid for utilities. Sometimes I helped with money for groceries. Sometimes Stephen joined in, covering the costs when they needed extra money to organize a real wedding a year after their quiet nuptials. "You're too soft," Stephen teased me as we paid their bills one more time. "But that's probably what makes you such a good older sister." I was smiling, but inside I felt uneasy. Time passed. Penelope and Marvin graduated from college. I expected them to start looking for their own place now. But this conversation never took place. Every time I cautiously brought up the subject, there was a new excuse. They worked on starting a business, launching one idea after another, but all attempts failed. Their first attempt failed 6 months later. The second one lasted a little longer, but eventually also collapsed. The third was even more ambitious, but ended exactly the same way. They continued to live in my apartment and continued to count on my help. I tried to be patient. I understood how difficult it can be to get back on my feet. But the doubts grew. Are they really going to move out, or has my house become a convenient haven for them that they don't want to leave? One day at lunch, I couldn't stand it. "Stephen, I do not know what to do," I confessed. "I have a feeling that they are not going to move out." He laughed. "You're too sweet, Gaynor. Maybe it's time to set a deadline." I nodded, but deep down I was afraid it was too late. This conversation turned out to be the last normal thing between us, the last easy moment before everything started to fall apart. It was raining on Tuesday evening, and I got a call. I had just returned from work, kicked off my shoes, and was thinking about what to cook for dinner when the phone rang. The number was unknown. "Hello, this is Gaynor Harris," I replied, feeling a chill run down my spine. A dark, dry voice on the other end of the line said, "Yes, this is Officer Ramirez from the City Police Department. I'm afraid I have some bad news for you." The words that followed turned my world upside down. Stephen and Kendra were returning from the weekend when a tanker truck lost control on a wet highway, crossed the median, and crashed into their car. They both died on the spot. I remember how the phone slipped out of my fingers and thudded to the floor. I remember how the walls of the apartment made a noise, as if they had closed, swallowed me up. I remember trying to breathe, but the air was thick as water. The funeral was a blur. Black clothes, quiet conversations, the look of people full of pity. All I could think about was Jack and Noah, two boys who became orphans overnight. They were only 5 years old. On the night of the accident, they stayed with the babysitter. After the funeral, they were temporarily sheltered by Kendra's parents. 3 days later, I gathered everyone at my parents' house. Mom, Jim, Penelope, Marvin, and a few distant relatives. We were sitting in the living room, immersed in a silence that seemed almost tangible. The shock of the tragedy hung in the air, heavy and dense, like the rain that continued to fall outside the window. I stayed up all night thinking, crying, making probably the most difficult decision of my life. And now that everyone is seated, I stand up. His hands were shaking, but his voice remained steady. "I'm taking the boys," I said, feeling the words hang in the air, almost tangible, heavy. "I will educate them." The room froze. All eyes turned to me, and I saw doubt, anxiety, even fear in those looks. Mom spoke first. "Gaynor, dear, have you considered this? 2 5-year-old boys are a huge responsibility." "Of course I have," I replied. "They're my family, Stephen's family." Jim frowned. "But you're alone, Gaynor. You have a full-time job. How will you manage?" I looked around the room. "That's why I called you all. I'm not saying I can do it alone. I'm going to need some help. Sometimes a babysitter, sometimes just emotional or financial support." I expected nods, words of encouragement. I was expecting someone to say, "We're close, we will help." But instead, I was met with silence. Averted glances, the wall of indifference. Mom sighed heavily. "Your father and I are no longer young. We don't have the energy to chase after 2 boys. And retirement is just around the corner. We have to be careful with money." "I'm not asking for money," I said, feeling my irritation rise. "I'm asking you to be grandparents, to look after them sometimes." Mom lowered her eyes. "We will visit them, of course, but don't count on us as your constant help. You'll have to hire a babysitter." I turned my gaze to Penelope, hoping at least for her support, but she lowered her eyes and said softly, "Maybe you should consider adopting. Give the boys to a family that is ready, who can handle it. They create problems for everyone." Problems, she called them problems. My brother's children. I got up slowly and picked up my purse and jacket. "If none of you want to help, fine. I can handle it on my own." When I left the house, I slammed the car door, feeling rage and despair tangle in a tight knot inside me. Stephen wouldn't leave any of us in the lurch. He would have fought. He would have stood until the end. Why can't any of them do the same for his sons? That night, I started acting. I called kindergartens, found out about after-school groups, and found a private babysitter to make sure the boys would be safe while I was at work. I've reviewed my budget and calculated all the expenses. I cleared out the bedroom, removed everything unnecessary from it. I ordered a bunk bed, put up new dressers, and chose toys that could please the boys and create at least a semblance of a home for them. The next day, I contacted a lawyer to begin the custody process. A week later, I was standing at the door of Penelope and Marvin's apartment. I didn't want to talk, but I knew I had to. I needed to see something in their eyes that I hadn't seen at that meeting. Hope, understanding, at least that's something. I calmed down enough to have a rational conversation, or at least that's what it seemed to me. "I'm going to have to rent this apartment out," I said, sitting at the kitchen table in Penelope's apartment. "I bought it 2 years ago, and now the boys need care, which is expensive. The rental income will help cover these costs." Penelope paled, her face flushed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you kicking us out? What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Are you serious?" "I'll give you 2 months to find another place," I replied calmly. That's enough. We can't afford another place, Penelope exclaimed. Our business is just starting to gain momentum. I stared at her in silence, feeling anger and fatigue rise in me. It's been 5 years, Penelope. You've been living here for free for 5 years. I paid for utilities, gave you money for groceries, and helped you when your car broke down. I did everything so that you and Marvin could get back on your feet. So we should be grateful for that, she interrupted, her eyes flashed with anger. Shouldn't you understand that circumstances have changed? Are you choosing these children instead of your own sister now? I stood up, feeling my voice tremble. I choose my family, I said. Stephen would have done the same for me. I headed for the door. 2 months, Penelope, find another place. In the following days, a flood of angry messages and letters began to pour in. Penelope accused me of betrayal, claimed that I was making a terrible mistake, that the boys would be better off with a real family, whatever that meant. Mom's messages were even more painful. You're crazy, kicking your sister out on the street because of 2 kids. If you want to play the martyr, you're welcome, but don't expect someone else to sacrifice for your choice. These words hurt, torn apart, but I knew I was on the right track. I'm not kicking her out, I said aloud, trying to convince myself that I was doing the right thing. I'm asking her to take responsibility for her life, like an adult. I'm not asking them to take care of my problems. I provide for the boys myself, I decide their future myself. But Mom's last letter was short, without emotion. Do whatever you want, don't write to me anymore. And just like that, in a few short weeks, I lost not only my brother, but also my family. Because she refused to leave 2 children who had already lost everything. True to my word, I gave Penelope and Marvin 2 months to find a new place to live. When the deadline expired, they moved out, but not without a final act of malice. When I entered the apartment, all I saw was a punch in the gut. The rooms turned into ruins. There's trash in every corner, stains on the carpet, holes in the walls, a broken bathroom sink. I stood on the threshold, looked at all this, and could not believe that those whom I called family could leave such chaos behind. I could have called Penelope, shouted, demanded an explanation. But what was the point? She made her choice. I made mine. Instead of wasting my energy fighting, I hired cleaners, planned repairs, and painted the walls myself. After a long weekend soaked in paint and fatigue, the apartment regained its former look. 2 weeks later, she was ready to turn in. It turned out to be easier to find tenants than I expected. The new rent was my salvation. With her help, I was able to pay for babysitting services, extend after-school care, and make my life a little easier. Meanwhile, Jack and Noah moved in with me. The transition was difficult. They cried at night, waking up from nightmares. Sometimes I could hear one calling for Mom and the other asking about Dad. Their faces seemed more mature than their years, as if they had already realized that the world could be cruel. The problems started at school. They were moody, they broke down, sometimes they just shut themselves in. I tried to be patient, but I felt my strength draining away. The school psychologist recommended therapy. I didn't think twice. I organized everything immediately, despite the additional costs. I knew what they needed: help, stability, routine. I made a schedule and strictly adhered to it. Morning classes, kindergarten, work, evening classes, bedtime stories. Everything is in order. I've never missed school events, even if I had to sacrifice my days off. I tried to be there for them, to show them that they weren't alone anymore. I put them to bed every night with the same promise. I'm here and I'm staying here. These words became an anchor for them in a world that once turned upside down and turned out to be too frightening and unpredictable. Gradually, the boys began to recover. Jack, who is more open and talkative, was the first to make friends at school. His smile began to appear more often. He began to bring home drawings, tell stories about his classmates. Noah, quiet and introverted, took longer to get used to, but eventually found solace in the chess club. He was silent, but there was a confidence in his gaze that had disappeared earlier after the loss of his parents. They both tried hard in their studies. I knew Stephen and Kendra would be proud of them wherever they were. Sometimes, when I sat on the edge of their beds and stroked their hair, I felt like I could feel my brother's presence. It was as if he was standing next to me, quietly approving my choice, strengthening my resolve. But no one from my family offered to help. Mom and Jim didn't call to check on their grandchildren. Penelope, of course, did not extend her hand. The only support came from Kendra's parents. They were elderly and lived 3 hours away, but every month they invariably sent a small check, a gesture that meant more than the amount. It was a confirmation that there are people out there who still care. Life has entered a new rhythm. My days turned into a carefully rehearsed dance: morning gatherings, work meetings, school trips, homework control, bedtime stories. I learned how to cook simple meals that the boys actually ate. She learned to judge their casual quarrels, kiss their torn knees, and mend their torn jeans. About a year after Penelope moved out, rumors began to spread. I learned from mutual friends that Penelope and Marvin had finally launched a successful business consulting firm. They quickly gained customers. "Your mom gave them some seed money," my cousin once said over a cup of coffee. But most of the money, it seems, was given by Marvin's friend from college. I nodded, smiled, and was genuinely happy for them. Despite the hurt, despite the bitterness, I wanted everything to work out for them. I've always known that Penelope is capable of a lot if she puts in the effort. But I didn't mention how hard it was to hear that a mom who claimed she didn't have the money to help her grandchildren had suddenly found the means to support Penelope's business. The boys were growing up and life was moving forward. When they turned 7, I was offered a promotion at work. This meant more hours, more responsibility, but also higher pay and more flexibility. We moved into a slightly larger apartment with a small courtyard where the boys could play. Life was difficult, but there was stability in it, and that was enough for me. And then the bell rang, the one who turned everything around again. It was Uncle Dave, my father's brother. He rarely interfered in family matters, so his voice on the phone surprised me. "Gaynor, are you going to Penelope's house on Saturday? Swim?" His voice was cautious. "What?" I froze. "Uncle Dave, I haven't spoken to Penelope in almost 2 years. I didn't even know she had a house." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "She and Marvin bought a house in Oakwood Estates. There's something else you should know." "What?" "She tells people a different version of what happened between you." "Another version?" I asked, even though my heart already knew what would happen next. "She says you kicked them out without warning, that you've become greedy and obsessed with money, and that you only took the boys for their inheritance, for financial gain." The blood froze in my veins. It's absurd," I whispered. "Stephen didn't have any property. The only money is the trust funds for education, which I can't even touch." "I know, Gaynor, I never believed in it," he said. "But others may not know the whole story." After he hung up, I paced the living room for a long time. Anger was pounding in his temples. But the worst part was realizing how cruel this betrayal was. She didn't just lie. She hinted that I was using Stephen's death and my nephew's for my own benefit. She tried to destroy my name, my reputation, my truth. I had two options: ignore it and hope that people would figure out the lies themselves, or talk to Penelope directly, to clarify everything. The old Gaynor might have chosen the former. She would have run away from the conflict. But not Gaynor, who spent 2 years fighting for the happiness and safety of two grieving boys, who has endured sleepless nights, pain, betrayal, and loneliness. I knew what I had to do. I got Penelope's address from my uncle. I arranged for my regular babysitter to stay late with the boys and decided to come to my sister's housewarming party. It wasn't just about the visit. I needed to be heard. It was Saturday evening. I dressed neatly, beautifully, but not provocatively. I wanted to look like what I am: an adult, a responsible person who has nothing to hide. a man who came not for the sake of conflict but for the sake of truth. As I drove to Penelope's new home in the prestigious Oakwood Estates neighborhood, I mentally rehearsed what I would say. I didn't want to make a scene, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. The house was impressive, newly built, with huge windows and a neat, well-kept courtyard. The driveway was lined with expensive cars, and guests strolled through the streets with glasses and light snacks. I parked a little further away, took a deep breath, and headed for the door. A stranger answered the knock, most likely one of Marvin's friends. I slipped past him before he could ask any questions. The house was full of people, talking, laughing. The guests held drinks and small plates of snacks, admiring the new furniture, decor, perfect wall lines, and glass surfaces. That's when I saw Penelope. She was standing by the marble fireplace, telling a small group about some interior details, clearly proud of her new home. She looked different. Expensive haircut, designer clothes. Success seemed to shine in her every move. But when her gaze fell on me, the smile disappeared. His eyes narrowed and his face tightened. She quickly apologized to her guests and came over to me. The grip on his wrist was sharp, almost painful. "What the hell are you doing here? Stop it," she hissed. "You weren't invited. You need to leave now." Before I could answer, Mom was there. Her face was hard, her voice harsh. "Gaynor, this is completely inappropriate," she said. "Don't ruin your sister's special day with your drama." The conversations around them died down. People turned around. I could see the curiosity in their eyes, and I could feel the air in the room getting tense. Everyone was waiting. Looked. And I realized that I didn't want to be silent anymore. I took a step forward, standing in the center of the room. "Hello, I'm Gaynor, Penelope's sister," I said. "The one that probably none of you mentioned." There was silence in the room. "Sorry to interrupt your party, but I found out that my sister was spreading lies about me, and I couldn't let that go unanswered." "Gaynor, stop it," Penelope screamed, but I held up my hand to stop her. "The truth is," I continued, "that Penelope and Marvin lived in my apartment. In my 5 years is free. I paid for utilities, gave money for groceries, and supported them when their businesses failed." I took out my phone, opened the photos and held it up, showing the guests. And that's how they left my apartment. I slowly scrolled through the images. Trash left everywhere, holes in the walls, a broken sink. Stains on the carpet, empty boxes, dirty plates. That's how they thanked me for 5 years of free housing and financial support. People began to exchange glances. I could hear quiet mutterings and I could feel the tension building. Someone was whispering questions. Why did you move out? Why didn't they help? 2 years ago, my brother Stephen and his wife Kendra died in a car accident. My voice cracked. They left behind 2 sons, 5-year-old boys. I took them away because they're family, because I love them. There was silence in the room again. It is expensive to raise 2 traumatized children. I needed the rental income from my apartment to pay for a babysitter, care, food, therapy. My own apartment. I opened another folder on my phone. Documents, Stephen's will, bank statements. Stephen didn't have any property. The only money is the trust funds for his son's education. I don't have access to this money. They are meant for their future, for their studies. I can't use them for everyday expenses. I felt everything inside me tremble, but I didn't stop. Penelope says I kicked her out. But I gave her 2 months to find a new place to live. I asked her to take responsibility for her life. All I asked was for her to finally grow up. The room was quiet. Penelope stood as if petrified. Her lips trembled, but she remained silent. "I didn't come here to make a scene," I said. "I came for the truth, to be heard, to be remembered." I looked around at everyone once more. Then she put the phone in her bag. "I'm leaving, but please think about it, about who and what you believe." And with that, I turned around and walked to the exit, leaving behind whispers, surprised looks, and a silence that sounded louder than any scream. The idea that I had taken Stephen's children for financial gain was not just a lie, but a cruelty that made my stomach clench. I couldn't leave her without an answer. I showed the guests screenshots of the messages and emails I received from my family after I took responsibility for Jack and Noah. I read aloud how my mother wrote to me, "Don't contact me anymore," and how Penelope once, without hesitation, suggested that I give the boys up for adoption because they create too many problems. After these words, a dead silence reigned in the room. I saw several of the guests look at Penelope with outright disgust. Some of them lowered their eyes, others exchanged awkward glances. It seemed that everything they had heard before that evening was beginning to crumble right before their eyes. I slowly looked around at everyone. "So, congratulations, Penelope," I said. "With your beautiful home, successful business. I'm sincerely glad that everything worked out for you, but don't build your happiness on lying about me and my nephews." I didn't expect an answer. I turned and walked to the door. No one tried to stop me, even Mom. A few people nodded almost imperceptibly. There was more to these gestures than politeness. Respect, compassion, or maybe it's just relief that the truth has finally come out. I came out feeling as if a weight of many years had been lifted from my chest. I didn't get my family back, but I did get my voice back. 3 days later, my mom called. Her scream was so loud that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You've ruined everything. Stop it," she screamed. "How could you be so selfish?" I was silent, letting her spill everything. Marvin and Bister's friend was at the party, the one who invested money in their business. He was shocked. He didn't know how Penelope talked about orphaned children. "Did you know that he was adopted himself? Your little performance struck a chord with him. Now he's taking his money." Mom's voice cracked. "They won't be able to pay the mortgage. Your sister could lose her house because of you." I stifled a bitter laugh. "It's not my fault, Mom. Maybe they shouldn't have lied about me." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, heavy and uneven. "We need help," she finally said, "with mortgage payments, until they find a new investor." I could hardly believe my ears. "Are you serious? After all that happened, after everything you've said to me, are you asking me for money? They're going to lose the house, Gaynor. Do you want this?" I closed my eyes, trying to contain my anger. "I have 2 children, Mom. It takes every extra penny to give them what they deserve. I can't help. These are the consequences of their choice, not mine." She didn't answer right away. Then it was short and cold. "Do whatever you want." And the phone went silent. I sat listening to the beeps, knowing that this was probably our last conversation for a long time. Maybe forever. The months passed. I found out through mutual friends that Penelope and Marvin were really having problems. They had lost their business space and were now trying to work from home, desperately looking for new investors. Mom and Jim helped them pay the mortgage, but it was clear that this support would not last forever. Part of me was sorry, not about what I did, but about how things turned out. I didn't mean them any harm. She didn't want to see their world crumble, but I knew it was a lesson they had to learn. Actions have consequences. Lying has consequences. Bad attitude towards family too. And I continued to build my life, my real family. Jack joined the high school football team. His eyes shone with pride when I came to the games, applauded his successful passes. Noah busied himself with the piano. His fingers deftly ran over the keys, and when I listened to him play, I knew that he found solace in these sounds. Of course, we still had difficult days. The boys still missed their parents. There were evenings when I would wake up to their sobs, when I would sit next to them on the bed, reminding them that they were not alone. But they were growing. They were getting stronger every day. With every achievement, every little victory, I knew Stephen would be proud of them. And maybe by me too. I've lost a lot: my brother, parents, my sister. But I've acquired something important: a family, goal, meaning. I became what these boys needed, and they became the ones I needed. As for Mom and Penelope, maybe one day they'll realize what they've lost. Maybe one day they'll want to meet the two amazing boys that Jack and Noah are becoming. Maybe. If that day comes, I'll think about what to do. I didn't close the door forever. Not for myself, but for the boys, for the sake of those who deserve to know what a real family is. But I also won't wait with bated breath. I have my own worries, lunches that need to be collected, homework that needs to be checked, permits to participate in basketball games, and two boys who are counting on me every day. Write a comment on what you think about this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.